So finally, on the period 1500 to 1700, we are looking at the experience of civilians during this period and whether it changed or not. And like a lot of things during this period, the most significant change is the English Civil War in the 1640s. So what we're saying is that between 1500 and 1700, civilians in England were not really directly affected by warfare. However, the civil wars, 1642 to about 1651, did obviously have a huge impact on people in this country. So I suppose what we're saying is that overall, the way civilians experienced war in this period was not really that different from what they experienced during the Middle Ages, but what was different was just the intense experience they had of warfare during the Civil War. So, if we do look at the English Civil War and look at the changes that took place there, there's one or two key bits of vocabulary here you might want to take a note of. Firstly, we had the burden of requisitioning, in other words, the forcible taking of foodstuffs usually to feed the armies during the war, and this happened for both sides. Civilians were also expected to provide quarter or accommodation in their homes, which was known as billeting the troops. Soldiers usually were not particularly good guests. They'd steal what they could, particularly if they were badly paid, and therefore billeting became one of the most unpopular burdens during the Civil War. Now, there was the hope that civilians would receive payment at some point as compensation for all of this, but it was very rarely paid in advance, and payment was sometimes never made in reality. Looting was extremely common, so as we've said, badly paid, poorly disciplined soldiers would just take what they wanted, sometimes by force. Taxation was increased and imposed by the government because obviously they had to pay for the wars, and this again impacted on civilians. The taxes would include taxes on the purchase of foods, salt, beer, etc. And as time went on, as you got towards the 1700s, actually, taxation and high taxation did become quite a normal, accepted thing. So though you saw it during the English Civil War during the 1640s, it did become more of a burden on civilians generally. Civilians were more expected than ever before to pay towards the cost of soldiers and soldiering and weapons during this period. As well as that, also, both sides also confiscated the property of wealthy opponents, would force wealthy individuals to give them money or to pay compulsory loans too. All in all, about 150 towns suffered major attacks or were besieged during the civil wars, and conditions in sieges could get really, really desperate. Diseases would spread, like plague. That was quite common. If a besieged town refused to surrender but was eventually captured, then the victorious soldiers were permitted to loot and destroy much of the town in revenge for that. So rape, murder of civilians was something that did happen during the English Civil Wars. Estimates for soldier and civilian casualties caused by the English Civil Wars, including combat and disease, was about 180,000, which doesn't sound a lot, but this is about 3.6% of the population, which is actually a proportion greater than the First World War, where soldier and civilian casualties was only about 2.6%, and the Second World War even less, 0.6%. So if you look at it in terms of percentage of the population, then the English Civil Wars in the 1640s were particularly hard, and civilian experience was extremely difficult. So it is the intensity of this conflict which so hurt the civilian experience of warfare during the period 1500 to 1700.